Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Lead Inclusively podcast series. I'm your host, Denise Hummel, the CEO and founder of Lead Inclusively, and I have with me Michael Bungay Stanier. And he, by the way, is a MG 100. We both have the luxury of being on Marshall Goldsmith's legacy team. That is how we met.
Yes,
Michael, I am so grateful to know you.
that's perfect. Now we have that secret Marshall Goldsmith handshake. The whole world
Exactly,
opens up.
exactly. No one's ever going to know that.
Exactly.
Um, but I want to start in a little bit of a different way than I'm used to starting. Normally, I would tell the world how incredible you are, and they are about to
But
find
but
that
you got
out.
nothing. You got nothing, so you're gonna have to go some other way. All
Not
right.
true.
Perfect.
Not in the least bit true. But I'm gonna sort of start a different way and make it a little, just a tiny bit more personal. Now,
Hmm.
as you know, our mission is all about inclusion, right? And
Right.
the benefits of inclusion in a business environment for real business impact. And so my question for you is, can you speak to any episode in life or experience or anything that you'd want to discuss with our audience about inclusion? I mean, we're looking at you. You're a white male. You're
Exactly.
attractive. I know you to be tall as well. And
I
so you've
am.
got all this
I
stuff
have a
going for
lot.
you,
I am
right? A
like
lot.
I'm an overeducated, straight, white, tall male who's eloquent. So, I got dealt a pretty good set of cards when that process was going on. But one of the things that people will already hear in my voice is I have a slight speech disability, and that's because I have a cleft lip and palate. And if you're not sure what a cleft lip and palate is, it's sometimes called a hair lip. When you're born as a baby, your top lip doesn't fully form up, and for some people, they'll also have the top of their mouth isn't fully formed as well. So for most people, if you run your tongue over the top of your mouth, that it's a smooth surface. For me, it's like there's a crevice in the middle of it. That was operated on when I was a young kid. So I've got this kind of what I would consider a minor form of. I'm not sure what the language is. It's not. I wouldn't call it a disability, but it is a mark of difference, I guess.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, for lots of a fair number of kids who have cleft lip and palate, there's all sorts of support groups for them growing up. There's one in Canada called About Face. There's one in the US called the Smile Train. There's great organizations around the world that, like in Nepal, where cleft lip and palates are particularly common, operating on kids and kind of changing their life through the operation. So I have that, and there's certainly been moments where I can think of at least three moments overtly when somebody, and a couple of times it was a boss of mine at the time, made some sort of joke about the cleft lip and palate in an attempt to be funny in a way that really wasn't very funny. It wasn't, it's that moment where if you've ever seen stand-up comedy where they lay the joke down and there's that awkward silence, that
Yep.
was kind of the experience like that. So there, and as a teenager, when you're self-conscious about everything, I mean, even if you're a perfectly formed, flawless human being, you're like, oh, I'm so this and so that. I was pretty self-conscious about my face then, because people with cleft lip palates, it's not just a lip, but I have a kind of flattened face and a sort of flattened top lip and stuff. So there's a profile that's literally associated with a cleft lip palate. But for me, I can't really say that um, there's a systemic exclusion as part of that. There's certainly moments where I felt hurt by the comments around that, from everything from ex-girlfriends to bosses or whatever. But the truth is, my dad had a cleft lip palate, and he's a really good man and a role model of mine. My brother closest to me in age was born with a cleft lip palate. When my youngest brother was born, and he wasn't born with a cleft lip palate, there was this moment of realization where he actually burst into tears because he was like, "I've been excluded from the cool club of every other person in my family has a cleft lip palate. What's going on here?" And I was like, "You, that's." So I had an advantage of a family where that was normalized. The fact that, as we said at the start, I did get dealt all the other cards, so there's that as well. I also got dealt and my parents don't know where this comes from particularly, but a very robust sense of self and self-confidence. So for me now, I spend, I'm not famous by any means, but I spend a certain amount of time on stages and presenting in front of people. And I've got to a point where my cleft lip and palate and the way I speak, I see as an advantage and a way of being more accessible to people
How is
rather
that?
than,
I'd like to know about
well,
that.
yeah, there's something about um, the power of vulnerability and the way that status can work. Here's an experience I get when I sometimes watch keynote speakers come up on stage. They come up and somebody reads out the introduction and they're like, this person has won a medal and climbed a mountain and has been recognized by a president and has got a 6.3 GPA. And it's like, there's this long list of accomplishments, which is both boring to hear and intimidating at the same time. And the work that I do in my life and I do for my company boils down to a foundation of going, can you help people connect and have relationships, and see each other for the person they are? I mean, if you want to get kind of philosophical about it, there's a philosopher called Martin Buber, and he says, look, two types of relationships: I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. I-it relationships are when you stop seeing the full human in front of you. It's a bit more of a transaction. I-thou is when you have a kind of human to human connection. You see them in their full glory and messiness, and you see yourself in your own full glory and messiness, and you're able to make that more powerful, you could almost say, spiritual connection. And, I'm not a religious man, but there is something powerful about that work. And part of what that requires is to lay down your armor and put down your shields. And there's a way that me having a cleft lip and palate is an invitation to vulnerability. Because I'm like, look, I'm up there and I've got a speech, disability of some sort. That actually somehow just feels like it gives people permission to just be a tiny, err on the side of being more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable.
I think there's also a very strong lesson here, if I just might offer my perspective. I think the fact that you do not see the cleft lip and palate and slight speech impediment as a disability, you were like, I guess you can't really consider it a disability, when the reality is, depending on who you are as a
Right.
person, I mean, a different person, Michael, might consider that a
For sure.
crippling disability, right? They might
That's
say,
true.
people are judging me by the fact that my lip looks different, or
Right.
they might say people are, on first blush, might feel that I'm not intelligent because they hear a certain speech impediment and make
Right.
certain associations with it. So I think the first thing that I'm picking up from you is, the blessing that you had in your particular family. One, that you weren't the only one. It was more in than
Right.
out to have
Yeah.
it, which is fascinating. But the second, that your parents obviously did a great job in terms of instilling you with a very core center of self-esteem, and also just the spirituality with which you
Yeah.
approach things, which is huge. um, and what I think, so I think I'm going to let the cat out of the bag now, and have you tell our audience what your accomplishments are. And I know that you're a humble person,
Yeah.
but if you don't mind, if you would tell
Sure.
them the full extent of your accomplishments, so that they can get a sense for the fact that you truly did not allow that impediment, disability, call it difference, call
Yeah.
it whatever you like, to get in your way.
Okay. Well, look, the shiny stuff on my resume, and just as long as everybody's hearing, going, look, there's so much stories about failure and stumbling and miscellaneous stuff that doesn't make the success list, but I've got a success list. And the most obvious ones are, I was a Rhodes Scholar, so won that prize when I was in Australia and went to Oxford University and did a master's degree in literature there. I've written 6 books, and the last one in particular was a big hit. It's called The Coaching Habit. Sold 750,000 copies now. I self-published it, and that's given me a certain amount of profile in that particular world for sure. I was just named the #1 thought leader in coaching, really on the back of the success of that last book. I started my own company called Box of Crayons, and that's been successful, and it's providing the core training around coaching skills for companies like Microsoft and Salesforce and kind of big well-known brands like that. So there's a sort of little medals that I can point to, which I'm very proud of, but I'm also just aware of so much of that is, it's hard work, a certain amount of talent, a certain amount of hard work, a certain amount of magic fairy dust happening, and you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. I mean, I'll tell you, as an example, here's a story. So I'm applying to be a Rhodes Scholar. And the first thing you need to know is I applied in 1990, and I went up and I went, so how does this whole Rhodes Scholarship thing work? And the woman said, look, you apply, everybody gets a first round interview, then we shorten the list, and you get in, there's a second round, and then we pick the winner. I'm like, fantastic. So I sent in my application. I got a letter back going, we're not even giving you a first round interview. I was like, I can't believe it. You told me everybody got a first round interview, and somehow my application sucked so badly I didn't even get that first round. So I kind of went away and licked my wounds for a while, and then went, okay, I'm going to reapply. And in my final year at university, I applied again. And this time it was a better application. So I got into the shortlist, and I get summoned in for my interview. And it's a pretty intimidating moment because there's a panel of 12 people. They're in this old room, so there's oak panels everywhere. I can't be sure, but at the time, it feels like in my memory, kind of they're all silhouetted and they're shining a bright light in my eyes. So it's like an interrogation out of some weird movie. And they said, here's the opening. And, I'd sweated this, so I prepared all my answers around every question I could think of. And the first question I hadn't prepared, they said, Michael, you've got a BA in literature, and you're about to finish a law degree, and you've applied to do a degree in politics in Oxford. What's wrong with you? Can't you make up your mind?
Interesting question.
Yeah, exactly. But my answer, and it was just spontaneous, I went, well, yes and no. And everybody laughed because I'd accidentally made a joke. And I was smart enough to realize that I'd made a joke and it had laughed. And what was great about that is everybody now relaxed. I relaxed, they relaxed, and we were into this interview, and it went really well, and I ended up winning the Rhodes Scholarship. But it's like, it's these little moments of luck. Another random story from that, just to show you how perilous all of this stuff is. The night before, the group of shortlists, so there's like 15 people on the shortlist. We all go out to dinner in Parliament House in Canberra in Australia. It's like going to the White House in the States for dinner. So it's a really posh thing. And of course, it's a beautiful room, and it's a beautiful meal. And it's at the same time, it's a terrible meal because everybody's trying to compete with everybody else, but in a way that doesn't really look like you're competing. And I was like, oh man, these people are so good. I've got not a chance here. So what I decided to do was to steal a teaspoon. So I'm like, I'll take it as a memento, and I'll be like, look, this is the teaspoon from Parliament House, and it's my memento of the time I almost became a Rhodes Scholar. And then I forgot because I got a terrible memory. And why that was a relief was as you leave Parliament House, you go through a metal detector just to make sure you're not stealing anything. So I'm like, oh man, who knows how the interview would have gone the next day if they'd caught me stealing a teaspoon, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have meant a congratulations, you're now going to Oxford. So, all of these stories are they're funny, but they're also just an indicator around part of what success is putting yourself in the game to have a chance. But then you just got to get lucky. And I know I've been lucky in a bunch of things.
I assumed you took the spoon out of your pocket or wherever before you left. Was that the general gist?
I just forgot. I'd had this idea, and I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. I'll definitely do that.
Oh, you forgot to do it.
I just forgot to do it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So there was some higher power that was on your side, I think.
Like yeah, exactly.
So I don't know if you know this about me, but I actually back in the 90s litigated and won the first class action under the Americans with Disabilities Act when I was an attorney.
I do know that.
And I fancied that when I started my career in diversity and inclusion, that I could really leverage that experience and knowledge in my journey. And what I have found is that while there is budget for women and for advancing people of color as well in these initiatives and enterprise, there is almost always not budget or not adequate budget to address the disability issues. So I'm going to ask you kind of a weird question, but I'm going
Sure.
to ask you if you have a suggestion for our listeners, and they're going to be, a lot of them are actually diversity and inclusion practitioners and leaders who do care about these issues, either because
Yeah.
they themselves have disabilities, sometimes hidden disabilities, or family members or what have you. And the question is this: is there anything that companies can do, either one manager leader at a time or as companies as a whole, to have the same sort of positive impact that your parents had on you with the people that they're managing and interacting with? Is there anything that could be done, even one person at a time?
That's a big question, and I'm no expert in D&I, so um, I'm a little wary of trying to offer up some suggestions to people who know far better than I do what might happen, and what actually works. And also just the danger of going, this worked for me, therefore we can scale it up to some sort of overall solution.
Well, do you remember when I approached you about this podcast and I
Yep,
was very nervous? Do you remember that?
I do. Yeah.
Because I felt that you had a lot to offer on the basis of what was a slight visual and slight audit,
Hmm.
a slight
Yeah, the
speech
speech impediment. Yeah.
impediment. And I had to tell you that. I had to
Yeah.
actually express that, and I had to do it in a way that was not at all offensive, and I was worried about it. And the way I handled it, which I have no idea. I mean, you're on the show, so
Yeah.
obviously it wasn't horrible. But
Yeah.
the only way I could think of to handle it, and granted, you and I know each other, so it was a little easier, was to say, I have an awkward question to ask you.
Right.
I feel like I might mess up,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so I need to just say it. And I am open to criticism or optimization of how I might approach this differently. But if I don't at least try,
Yeah.
then I can't move ahead.
Well,
And
Denise,
then and
yeah,
then you were open to it, and we talked about it. And so, what
exactly.
was that like? What could I have done differently? Does that
Well,
inform this discussion at
it
all?
does. I mean, I've got some principles that I use in general for the way I try and approach people and invite them into a conversation or relationship. So some of these might be scalable. I think one of them you're pointing to, actually two of them you're pointing to, it, by pointing to our interaction and setting this up. The first is framing, which is like, let me set expectations so that you understand where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to do here, and that I show up with a good intent. That just kind of means that I'm not on the back foot. Because if you just come up going, Michael, you got the speech thing going on, so how about the podcast? I'd be like, okay, what? where did that come from? And you're like, you kind of warmed me up. The other thing, which is kind of what we're doing now, and you also checked in at me when we met and had this conversation, was after the conversation, you asked about the conversation. You went, you know, what did I do? What could I do differently next time? What's the lesson I can take out of this experience?
Mhm.
So there's a kind of an active commitment to go, how does this work and how did it work? How did I think about that? So I think those are two useful things right away. I've got two other suggestions. One is based on the work around nonviolent communication. So Marshall Rosenberg. And I love his very simple model as I understand it. And it helps me just keep my communication a little cleaner and a little clearer. And basically, he says communication has four parts to it: there's data, there's feelings, there's judgments, and then there's wants and needs. And what normally happens is all of that stuff collides in our head and swirls around in a holy mix, particularly data and judgments. They kind of get meshed up together. Feelings don't often get talked about, particularly if you're a white man, but just in general, people aren't that good at owning their own feelings. And people are often poor at being clear about the request that they want to make. And there's a way to say, in communication in general, being able to tease these apart and then be more deliberate about what you share in a conversation can be really helpful. So for me, I'm always like, ground any conversation in data. That's really helpful, because then we just figure out whether we've got a shared understanding of the facts. I use this particularly in feedback preparation. I'm thinking about feedback. Get clear on what you want, because when you're clear on what you want, the conversation becomes, it has a natural arc to it. So part of what made our conversation easier is you're like, I've got a goal to have you come on the podcast because you'll have an interesting perspective. And that just framed, this is why we're talking about this. And then feelings and judgments. We have so many judgments. I mean, it kind of predominates all the stuff that's floating around your head. It's the judgments. And you have judgments about the other person. You have judgments about yourself. You have judgments about the situation. So, you could have gone, okay, I've got judgments about Michael. He seems to know what he's talking about, but he doesn't seem to be too concerned about his cleft lip and palate. He's a remarkably good-looking man. You probably didn't have that judgment, but never mind. You probably had judgments about yourself. Like, I know how to handle conversations like this. I don't know how to handle conversations like this. I don't know how to have this conversation with straight, white, tall man. I mean, who knows? And then judgments about the situation, which is like, this is a safe space to ask it. This is not a safe space to ask it. All of that.
Exactly.
It's just helpful knowing all of that around, and then choosing which judgments you might share that are useful to move the conversation forward. And then you go 5 core feelings: mad, sad, glad, ashamed, and afraid. So you go, and you kind of did this. You're like, Michael, I'm a little nervous because I'm not sure how this conversation will go. This conversation could be a little awkward.
And there was, by the way, just to interject in terms of the shame part of this, they were shamed too, because I'm a diversity and inclusion professional. Marshall's named me, the world leader in diversity and inclusion, and I have to come and ask a question that might be a big mistake that might result in offending someone. Right. That the shame piece of that was high.
Yeah, sure. So then you're like, it's useful to understand what's going on in you. And then it's useful to go, how much of this is worth sharing in this conversation that moves it forward or not? And often in conversations, our judgments, when we're not clear that they're judgments, they can derail the conversation a little bit. So really helpful just to go, look, what I want is to invite Michael. The data is Michael does have a cleft lip and palate. We have a shared kind of communal understanding because of the Marshall Goldsmith piece. Michael is eloquent. Mike, I have a diversity podcast. I mean, all of those are the facts. And then you're like, hey, so here are the facts, and you kind of shared them. And then here's my judgment, which was like, here's my want. I'd like you to come on as a guest. Here's my judgment. Well, this is awkward, and I'm a little embarrassed that it's awkward because I should know better. And you may take offense because I don't know you particularly well. And teasing it apart meant that you kind of constructed a conversation that allowed me to enter into it.
Now, there's one more piece of this that I want to share with you, which is what how you spoke about earlier in the podcast, the difference between when you're interacting with someone and kind of, and you're going to have to reframe this because I'm not going to say it the way you did, but the gist of it was that you can be interacting with someone and really see them. You're present, they're present,
and I thou. Yeah.
That's it. Exactly. And then there are times, and I will tell you, for me, the typical scenario would be a networking situation where I don't know the people. Right. Yeah. And I'm forcing myself to have a conversation, and I'm actually wishing I was not there. This is me talking. Yeah. I with you that wasn't the case, of course, because the MG100s are like my family. Yeah. But in a random networking situation, it's quite different. Yeah. But And so your statement about the judgments of actually, and the data of actually evaluating the circumstances, the nature of the relationship. And I was taking a little bit of a chance because we don't know each other very, very well,
Right.
but not as much of a chance because I know what kind of human being you are and that you would likely give me a chance to mess up and then
Right.
in a very kind and collegial way be part of my learning and growing process, right?
Sure.
This comes up in a lot of circumstances. Like if you and I were working together, we show up at the same meetings every day, and
Yeah.
I'm looking at you, let's say I'm looking at your face, and I'm wondering to myself, I wonder how that happened. I wonder
Yeah.
if he was born with that. I wonder how he feels about the slight speech impediment, and I don't actually get a chance to say that. Then it ruminates in my brain and sort of interferes in the rest of the ability to really see you, because I'm
Right.
wanting the answers to those questions and I'm afraid to ask them. So another situation, and I'm talking, in reality in the workplace would be,
Yeah.
you see someone who, based on, it could just be their dress, it could be
Right.
androgynous dress, haircut, uh, you know, uh, way of physically interacting in the world, where you're asking yourself, does that person identify as a man, as a
Yeah.
woman, heterosexual or not? And it's actually none of your business,
I
right?
think that's part of it. Yeah.
But you're still thinking about it, and wondering if you have this opportunity to engage in this safe conversation. And the reason why this is important is, you may have heard, we talk about the 3 R's of inclusion, and one of them is that, well, it's receptive, reflective, and revitalizing. Receptive is not just being accepting of the differences in others, but actually showing active curiosity in a very, obviously appropriate and collegial way. And a lot of people in the course of my work will say to me, I don't know how to have these conversations. I don't know how to be safe. And I don't,
And what do you
right?
recommend? Because I mean, I feel a little bit the same. Like it's one thing. I'm fine if somebody comes up to me and goes, "Hey, Michael, what's up with your face? What's up with your lip?" Because I'm like, I'm really comfortable with it, and
But in a
I've
work
processed it.
environment, that
Yeah.
probably would not work,
Right.
because it would open up, there's too much vulnerability there. There's too,
Exactly.
like you said, there's no context.
Exactly.
And so what I would often recommend, and I want you to call me on it, because if this
Yeah.
doesn't sound right, tell me. But what I would normally recommend is to wait till you actually know the person, in more than just, I've seen them once or twice, but give
Right.
yourself time to actually know each other and to build sort of a little bit of a trust relationship, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, to have context for actually wanting to ask the question, which is, I think that's the way you put it, which is, what is my motivation? If my motivation is knowledge, that's one motivation. If my motivation is to get to know the person better, their
Yes.
journey, that's another. I could have a friend or colleague or a family member who has a similar situation and might want to get some advice. So all those motivations are important, that I be clear on them and that I be able to express them. If I'm asking someone
Yeah.
else to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
I need to be vulnerable too. I also think that doing it in a private setting, like,
Totally.
as opposed to in front of a whole bunch of people,
Exactly.
is fairly critical.
Can
And
I jump in and add something
yes,
there? Because
please,
I think
absolutely.
it's a really useful, deliberate strategy to go, am I providing as many exit routes as possible so that we don't lose face?
I love
Because
that.
because if you make it a win-lose scenario, somebody wins and somebody loses, or at least that's what's at risk. So in a slightly different context, which is just in general how you offer up ideas and solutions when you're coaching somebody, which is more my kind of area of expertise. I will teach phrases that are all about diminishing the offer so that it can be turned down and nobody loses face. Because if I come to you and I go, Denise, here's the idea that you need to fix this thing that you asked me about, and you're like, that's a terrible idea. Where do we go from that? We're
No,
just
yeah,
we're just set
exactly.
up.
You've
We're
shut
just
down
set
the
up. One of
conversation.
us is going to lose now in this conversation. But if I go, look, Denise, I'm not really sure. I'm no expert here. but I'm going to just take my best guess and let me just put it on the table. It might be completely wrong, but here's one possibility for going forward with this. Now, if you go, oh, it's interesting, but that's not going to work. I'm like, yeah, I thought so. That's fine.
Right.
And
Right.
and and we can both look at this and go, yeah, Michael offered it up in a degree of humility and uncertainty and willingness to say it might be wrong, and now we can walk away from that.
Yep. I think one of the things I said to you when I was, initially speaking to you was, um, I have no clue as to whether you're going to be comfortable with this. And if you're
Right.
not, we can just, change
Exactly.
the subject and I'll
Yeah.
just apologize ahead of time, for bringing it up, sort of thing, which would have given you the opportunity to say, Denise, I really appreciate that your, curiosity about this, but to tell you the truth, it's not something that I talk about. It's kind of personal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I do also love your point around understanding your motivation. Because there are times where I've been on the other side going, oh, what's going on with that? Whatever that might be. And then I'm just like, people are just so complicated and interesting, and everybody's got something messed up with them in one way or another, or different about them in one way or another. Why do I even need to know? Is this in service to our relationship? Is it in service to something else that is in my life? Or is it just me kind of going, oh, it'd be good to know this?
Yep.
And mostly I try and sit with the place going, you know what, I can wait for this to emerge if it's appropriate at the time that it shows up, rather than needing to kind of nudge it forward and go, I just satisfy my curiosity, please. I'm
Yes,
like,
and that, gosh, that is a very important point, and I just want to kind of
yeah,
buttress that a little bit before, and then I really want to hear about your book.
sure.
But that is another point, is that, for example, if you speak to a person of color and you want to ask them about the history of slavery, their response might be, I am not your personal repository of
Exactly.
historic information.
Go
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 look
do
it
your
up
own
on the
work.
internet.
Yeah,
That is
exactly.
not a good motivation.
Yeah.
If I were wanting to ask about their personal journey, related to,
Yeah.
how being a non-white person, for example, might have impacted their journey as they rose to the top, or what have you, because I really am genuinely interested in their experience. That is a completely different
Right.
scenario.
Right.
But what I really do want to ask you about, and you were nice enough, Michael, to make your new book available to us. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about it. It's the newest one is Advice Trap, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how does, first of all, how does that differ from your other books, and what made you write it to begin with? What
Yeah.
was the impetus?
So, the coaching habit. Um, I spent 3 years with the coaching habit trying to get a publisher to publish it. And I really thought I was going to get it done because an earlier book I'd written called Do More Great Work, it got picked up by a New York publisher. It sold maybe 100,000 copies or thereabouts. So it's like, I've got a bit of a track record. I'm worth something. I spent 3 years trying to get this publishing house to pick it up. And they're like, no, not quite. It's not right. Not yet. And I was like, ah. And finally, at a certain point with the coaching habit, I was like, okay, I've come back to connect with why I think this is a really good book. And I've got to the point where I'm like, look, publish it, don't publish it. I don't care. You just need to give me a yes or a no, because the maybe is killing me here.
Right.
And they went no. And I was like, what? I was outraged. I was pretty sure that I was pushing them into a yes negotiation.
But it's a lot better than not knowing.
It's a lot better than not knowing. And of course, it worked out really well for me, because that rejection then made me go, well, I'm going to self-publish it. And now it's sold 750,000 copies. So it's like I've got more control, I've got more flexibility, I've got more money, I've got better.
Wow.
I mean, there's all sorts of good things that came out of that.
So you still, you didn't take that rejection as validation that what you had done, that there wasn't a market for it. You were like, I'm going to reach the world. And then you just went and did it.
Well, I can't say that I'm going to reach the world, because with books, most books sell less than 2,000 copies. So you've got to have a really strong motivation to go, I just
Well,
think this
three
book
quarters
is
of a
worth writing.
million is a lot more than a handful of
I know.
copies, though, isn't it?
It totally is.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but I was willing to back myself. I went, I've got a good reason to do it. I've got an ecosystem that supports the book, meaning that if people buy the book, there's a chance I'll go and buy programs that I have to sell through Box of Crayons. So I'm like, it's worth it. I see the balance between the risk and the reward, and I'm prepared to throw the dice on that. So over the 4 years since that came out, I've had just a lot of wonderful emails and feedback going, this book was really helpful, just 7 questions. It's changed the way I think about coaching. I started using the questions. My team and family and parent relationships, they're all better. And of course, I love these emails because they're basically saying, Michael, you're a genius. And I'm like, yeah, it's true. I am a genius. But
I love it.
there's a lot of people who I'm sure pick up and I don't hear from them, but they pick up the book and they read it and they quite like it. But for some reason, they find it very hard to change their behavior. So even though they're like, in theory, I get that I should be curious a little bit longer. And in theory, I understand that it's just a question of using the 7 questions or even just some of the 7 questions. But in practice, I just like giving advice, and I
Well,
keep doing that.
let's talk about that, because I am my kids who are, at this point, college age, they are always bringing to my attention that I am overcoaching, or that I am constantly offering unsolicited advice. And by the way, I do that a lot, especially the more I care about somebody, the more
Totally.
unsolicited advice I give them, because I consider that I'm giving them value, that I'm sharing
Exactly.
my wisdom and that I'm giving them my mind share. And isn't that a wonderful thing?
What a
Which,
gift.
yes, which I am now aware that people don't actually like unsolicited advice. But
Well,
what
it's
are
it's it's
these?
connected to the conversation we're just having around how you have a conversation about a person with a difference or a
Hmm.
person that and the like, which is like, what's your motivation for
Hmm.
this, and who's it really serving?
Right.
And
It's
when you
yeah.
get the insight,
It's helping me to pontificate about how smart I am. That
and
as a,
to make you
yeah.
go, I'm committed as a mother, and I'm showing them that I love them, and I'm still important in their lives, and I can still shape their destiny a little bit. I mean, I don't know
Darn
you
it,
or your
Michael! Why do
kids.
you have to be so smart? How
Oh, no,
annoying!
exactly. And there's and there's more to you than just building a brilliant business. I mean, there's a lot of deeper motivations that could be
Yep.
behind the reason why you love to give your kids advice.
So, what are
But
these questions, and how are they used to avoid the advice trap?
well, the starting point, I think, is for you to go, for people just to realize that quite possibly they have an advice monster. This is the metaphor we use, which is like when somebody starts talking, and the closer you are to them, often the more violent your advice monster is. As soon as they start telling you something like, hey, mom, I'm back from school, and you're like, oh, let me tell you some stuff. Because I was in school 30 years ago. I should know. I know stuff. And in the book, we talk about these 3 different personas of the advice monster. There's tell it, there's save it, and there's control it. And it kind of speaks to these deeper motivations about why we like to give advice, what giving advice gives us. Tell it, which is the noisiest of the advice monsters. It's like, oh, my job is to have all the answers all the time. And that's how I get validation, and that's how my ego gets stroked, and how I get status,
Oh, heck
and,
yeah!
and how I get reassurance, which is like, oh, I'm the person who needs the answers.
Hmm.
Of course, the standard is you need to have all the answers to all the problems all the time, which is impossible and overwhelming and kind of frustrating. The second advice monster is save it. And it's going to put its arm around you and go, Denise, your job is to make sure nobody fails. Don't let anybody fail, ever. Don't let them fail at anything, even the stuff that you don't even know that they're doing. Don't let them fail at that, because if they
Hmm.
fail, you fail.
Hmm.
And of course, that's impossible. I'm not a parent myself. I'm happily child free, but you know how impossible it is to save your children and rescue them. They're off on their own.
Or your friends, or your lovers, or your
Or
husband or wife.
anybody,
Yeah,
or anybody.
yeah. Or your
And then
clients, for that matter.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then your third persona is control it. Control it, which is the sneakiest of the 3, goes, look, the only way you win is if you make sure you're in control of everything all the time. So make sure you got your fingers in every pie, make sure you're shaping every conversation, make sure that you're clear on what the outcome is. Don't let any kind of random factors in, because then you lose control. And when you lose control, you fail.
Yep.
And all of us
But
have
that's a really tough parameter for a leader, right? Because it can be paralyzing.
They're all impossible. They all set impossible standards. You cannot have all the answers. You cannot rescue all the people. You cannot control the chaos. And we do our best to fight it because we've been trained for years to think that we can. And part of what Taming Your Advice Monster does is it opens up a willingness to empower others, not by giving them the answer, but by helping them find their own answer. Mm-hmm. To not rescue people, but by helping them find their own paths, not to kind of control the chaos, but open up to the future and see people step in and step up to what that offers.
Michael, I assume that you know that there's an overwhelming connection between what you just said and what we do in the area of inclusion in terms of empowering people rather than telling them what to do so that they can become the future leaders of tomorrow.
Well, exactly. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's where we started, which is how do you have these conversations, and because it comes down to this kind of foundation piece, I think, around I, it, and I, thou. Mm-hmm. Because when you're giving them the advice, here's the message that you're actually saying: you're not good enough. I'm better than you. That's what you're saying. I'm better than you, and you're not good enough. And that is the dynamic when you're just got that default response to giving advice, because advice itself is fine. It's the default response to say, my job is always to give you advice. And you know this better than I do, Denise, but surely that's exactly the same dynamic that happens in the diversity inclusion conversation, which is there is an unspoken statement in the dynamic that's playing out that I am better than you and that you're not good enough. You're not fast enough, smart enough, capable enough, experienced enough, whatever it might be. And that dynamic just plays out. And we're all trying to get to that same place going, see the person for all that they are, not for what they lack.
Michael, even with the best of intentions, right? Because I mean,
totally.
We're wanting, for example, as women, as people of color, we're wanting mentorship and sponsorship, but we're wanting it in a way that is not patriarchal, that is not condescending, right?
Yeah,
that is more as being a partner, to getting this done. So let me ask you a question, because we're getting kind of to the end of our time here. I know that went too fast, actually. We might have to do a follow-up at some point. Should we leave people hungry for more about the 7 questions? Because, for example, that book is sitting on my shelf. I started it on the airplane on the way back and didn't get to finish it. And I'm dying now to read it this weekend. Should we leave them just clamoring for more?
I will say this: if people want to Google the 7 questions, the coaching habit's been out for 4 years, so that they're everywhere. If you Google the coaching habit questions, but let me give you 2 questions that people might be able to take and use right away. And I call these the bookend questions. In the new book, The Advice Trap, I talk about why pairing questions can be so powerful. And the bookend questions give you a way in and a way out of a conversation that can be powerful. The opening question, the kickstart question, as we call it, is simply what's on your mind. And what's on your mind is a powerful question because it says to the other person, I'm asking you to bring the agenda. I want to hear what you want to talk about. But it's also focusing. It doesn't say tell me everything or tell me anything. It says, what are you excited about or worried about or overwhelmed by, or waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and thinking about? Let's go to the thing that matters most to you. So it is both subtly directive, but very empowering at the same time.
Love it.
And you can pair that with the question number 7 in the book, which is the learning question. And that question is, what was most useful or most valuable here for you? What was most useful or most valuable here for you? And what that does is 3 things, actually. The first is it asks the other person to extract the value from the conversation. And quite frankly, a lot of time people don't do that. They don't realize what a brilliant conversation they've just had. And they forget it almost instantly. By asking that question, you just disrupt the slide onto the next thing. And you go, extract the value. Secondly, and this is really important, I think, in the D&I space, is you get feedback on what actually worked so that you can do more of that next time.
Yep.
And when you hold let's call it a dominant perspective, like I would as a straight white man, I don't always know what was most valuable or most important to the other person. I don't get what worked and what didn't work. And I think the third thing you get, and this is a little more tricky, a little Machiavellian, is if you are constantly asking people what was most useful or most valuable about this conversation, you are constantly framing an interaction with you as being valuable and interesting and useful. And it just builds your reputation as being somebody who nurtures and is able to bring out the valuable, interesting, useful stuff in people and in an interaction.
Okay, so let me end this podcast then by asking you, Michael, what was the most valuable part of this interaction for you?
Exactly. So I'm going to answer that. But I also think it'd be interesting to have the people who are listening in that to get them to share their feedback with you around. So what are they taking
Yep,
away from this? You know,
totally agree.
how interesting was it?
Yep,
Where did it really strike a chord?
yep.
You know, for me, it I hadn't really made the connection, the one that you made just minutes ago, going that same dynamic in the advice trap, which is I am better than you, you are not good enough, is exactly, I think, what you're saying is really the same or very similar to the dynamic that plays out in the diversity and inclusion space.
Hmm.
I hadn't quite seen how that work is kind of rooted in the same foundations. How about for you? What was
Well,
most useful for you?
for me, that I was lucky enough to test my interaction with a trusted colleague, and that you are giving enough and open enough and consultative enough to have given me a response, and and it was a positive response. But I truly believe that if I had messed up, that you would have said, "Okay, Denise, here's what I experienced." You would have probably assured me, I think, that you understand that it wasn't my intent, but you would
Right.
have been able to contribute to my growth as a human being in a way that, wasn't you did this, you did that, or advice, 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 but would be sort of a consultative
Right.
conversation. And it came alive quite beautifully here. And the connection between that and your book and your new book is just wonderful. And i
That's
do i
perfect.
do hope that we will have the opportunity, as the book gets out there, to discuss this even further.
Well, let's ask the people who are listening to this, which is if you got this far, should we do a part two on this,
Yeah,
or
let us
or
know.
if you feel not, if you're like, please, Denise, do not invite Michael back again. Do not copy me on that email because I don't want to know that. But do
Okay, I
let
won't tell
Denise
you.
know because she will want to know. Yeah.
That sounds great. Okay, I am Denise Hummel. I am the CEO and founder of Lead Inclusively. This is the Leading Inclusively podcast. I'm here with Michael Bungay Stanier, and I'm feeling very, very grateful, Michael, to have had you here.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thanks. See you all again very soon.